This has been less NATO, it has been Donald Trump.
Is it the Game of Thrones where they've got that little king and they say, I think the king needs a nap now? It's sort of that
Big
kind
king.
of language.
He wouldn't like being called a little king.
Not a little king, but
No,
a big. But I think
king.
the king might need a nap.
Yeah.
And so they're all running around saying, how can we make him happy? How can we make him stay? How can we make him concentrate?
It is an organisation that during his first term, he repeatedly questioned the point of, why America was a member of it. He wants blind loyalty.
Yeah, I wonder whether what we're reaching for is that they're treating it slightly more like they're dealing with an autocracy.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Quite frankly.
Yes, exactly.
I mean,
They do papers on it, Marco. Maybe we're going to do papers. I don't even know if you need them. They're not going to be fighting each other. They've had it. They've had a big fight, like two kids in a schoolyard. You know, they fight like hell. You can't stop them. Let them fight for about 2-3 minutes. Then it's easy to stop them.
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language to
You have to use
stop
strong
them.
language. Every once in a while, you have to use a certain word.
I think we have to join the house.
that was the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, sitting beside President Trump, calling him Daddy in so many words. It gives you a sense of the fear and flattery that has dominated this second day of the NATO summit.
We've never seen a NATO summit, perhaps any summit, quite like this. European and NATO leaders treating Donald Trump not so much as a fellow leader, but as something more akin to a world king. Has it worked? Has it achieved its objective, which is to make sure that if attacked, Donald Trump would send American forces to protect the rest of us? Welcome to the news agents.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And it is chaos.
And it's everybody else.
It's literally everyone else. We are at meeting point 1 in the centre of the media centre.
At least it's meeting point 1.
At least it's meeting point 1. And you might see, if you're watching this on video, some of the huddles that are taking place around us. This is where the leaders are coming to give their communiques. We've just had the sort of memorandum that has been put out. And this is the chance for journalists to come and grab whatever sound bites they can, understand a little bit more about what has been agreed, and principally the overriding feeling of what has come through is a massive sense of relief that the NATO members have got everyone to the table and everyone has agreed to 5% spending on defence within the next decade. But they have refused to condemn Russian aggression in simple words. And I think that has made many of the states closer to Russia, on Russia's border, pretty uncomfortable.
Yeah, we said yesterday this was going to be Donald Trump's summit.
Yeah.
And of all of the member states of this 76-year-old organisation, this has been less NATO, it has been Donald Trump. And what can we do? The essay question that's been running through this very short summit has been, how do we keep Donald Trump happy? How do we keep Donald Trump in? Because, of course, the long story of Donald Trump's relationship with NATO has been a deeply, deeply checkered one. It is an organisation that during his first term, he repeatedly questioned the point of, why America was a member of it, consistently floated the prospect that America might withdraw from it. As recently as yesterday, getting on the plane, he was questioning the principal component of NATO membership, which is Article 5. Article 5, you'll hear about it all the time. Basically, it is an attack on one is an attack on all. And it was obviously designed to counter the threat of Soviet aggression. It kind of went into abeyance, really, although it was triggered by the United States itself in the aftermath of the September the 11th attacks. But obviously, it has found new meaning in this world where Russia is on the advance. Trump cast it into question, thereby basically making NATO, or the prospect of making NATO, completely pointless. And the whole point of this summit, from Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, has been to do everything he can, from everything to even the timing of it. It's a super short summit. The idea was like, Trump has no attention span, so let's just keep him here for 2 hours. Let's flatter him. Let's do everything we can to make him feel good. And of course, in the last 24 hours, we have seen Rutte be less a Secretary General, more a kind of emollient butler to Donald Trump, the sort of Jeeves to his Worcester. And he's played the part incredibly well. I mean, we saw over the last 24 hours, we just heard the daddy clip, which I have to say, I did not have Mark Rutte calling Donald Trump daddy on my 2025 bingo card, but, here we are. But we also saw Trump put on his Truth Social, the text exchanges that Rutte sent to him yesterday. And they were, I'll just read out just a little bit of it, because it is amazing, and it just sums up exactly what Rutte and the other European leaders have been trying to do. Mr. President, dear Donald, Congratulations and thank you for your decisive action in Iran. That was truly extraordinary and something no one else dared do. It makes us all safer. You're flying into another big success in The Hague this evening. It wasn't easy, but we've got them all signed up to 5%, exclamation mark. Donald, you have driven us to a really, really important moment for America, Europe, the world. You will achieve something no American president in decades could get done. Europe is going to pay in a big way, as they should, and it will be your win. And what I love about that is that Rutte is sounding more and more like he's tweeting as Trump as the message goes on. He's not just flattering Trump. He's becoming Trump, which is a good sort of metaphor for this organisation and this summit.
Yes,
yeah.
And what is extraordinary about that text, which was sent privately to Donald Trump, was if you look at the very bottom, it says 1 minute ago. In other words, Trump took the text from his phone, a private text, and put it straight onto Truth Social. And you can imagine a few red faces where journalists had to go back to Rutte and his team and say, was this actually what you sent? Was this actually signed off? Was this by the NATO Secretary General? And he had to say, well, yes, it was actually. And we have seen this before. I don't know if you remember the moment between Starmer and Trump where Starmer brandished that letter inviting Trump to a state visit. Now, the state visit has sort of raised its head again in exactly the same way that the Rutte problem has, because Starmer is now in a position where he thinks an early state visit for Trump would be very useful diplomatically, politically, and the King, we understand, has been pushing back on this and says, as King of Canada as well, I don't want to feel that Trump is leaping ahead of all those threats to Canada, of Canada being the 51st state. Let's just, we talked to people very close to the King who said we're going to push this state visit as far back in the Trump administration as we can, hopefully a couple of years. Starmer saying, no, bring it forward. And when Starmer went to see Trump back in, I think it was February, we understand that he actually gave him the letter privately the night before. And it was Trump's own idea to say, I tell you what, give this to me tomorrow in front of the press, in front of the whole global media. You can present me with it and I'll read it out and we'll all get the win. In other words, there is no difference for Trump between the private and the personal. If he can make capital from something, he will. He did it with Rutte, he did it with Starmer. And it sort of feels horrendously sycophantic. But we understand the game they're playing. And the game they're playing is, please stay here. As you said, it was a truncated meeting because they saw what happened at the G7. They saw Trump leave early. They saw how unhappy he was on the White House lawn before he left America to come here. He hates these summits
because he has to share the stage.
Well, I think he hates the summits, but I think he also was in a really bad mood last night. And it is a bit like, is it the Game of Thrones where they've got that little king and they say, I think the king needs a nap now. It's sort of that
big
kind
king.
of language.
He wouldn't like being called a little king.
Not a little king, but a big. But I think the king might need a nap.
Yeah.
And so they're all running around saying, how can we make him happy? How can we make him stay? How can we make him concentrate? Squeeze it all, accordion all it just down to 2 hours. And the sole purpose is, as you say, please just sign off that you are committed, A, to NATO, and B, to defending the rest of Europe, the rest of NATO, if something happens.
It is an extraordinary spectacle. Watching Rutte at the opening of the North Atlantic Council, which is a kind of the leaders' meeting here, openly talking in almost MAGA talking points, like sort of saying, Mr. President, you're the only one who could have achieved this. Europe and Canada will now pay. We weren't paying before. Now, a lot of the leaders there would sort of dispute that, or at least sort of, take issue with it. But none of them are going to demur from it. And like I say, they're treating him not like a sort of head of government. They're almost courtiers in his court now. And I think, you're right, in a sense, what choice do they have? They know that is born out of European frailty, European weakness. It's their own fault in a way. They're having to kowtow to him in this way. They don't want to do it. They don't like him in all sorts of ways. They don't like having to be supplicant.
You say it's their fault, but it was the structure of NATO that we understood that America was the dominant force. It was indispensable, but also that America got kudos from being that big player. We talk as if all America has ever done is given without taking anything back from NATO. And actually, that's not true. You know, we saw America's position on the world stage, you know, as a global leader, because that was something that they had wanted to carve out for themselves too.
Yes,
right?
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I suppose my point, though, is to say that over the last 10 years, it has been clear that America has been a less reliable security partner than it was because of Trump. And I don't just mean Trump either as well, but you know, post 2014, with the first Russian invasion of Ukraine, it was clear there was going to need to be greater European deterrence, even with a willing American administration with Obama.
Yeah.
And Europe didn't move; they were the sleepwalkers, right? So the reason they're now having to be supplicant to Trump is because a generation of European leaders did not take European defence seriously enough, with or without Trump.
I mean, Obama actually banned Ukraine from receiving the weapons it needed.
Indeed, Trump gave them to them. So you know, so it is that today is a net result of those decisions, and they know, and what they're doing is buying time. They're buying time because they know that it is possible that Trump commits to Article 5 here, but then decides to sort of cast out on it again in the future. So they're giving him a clear win, the sort of win that he liked, a media win, something that he can take home. They know that you could get a President Vance in the future, or a type of American president which is more akin to Trump than it is to Biden. So America is a long-term, less secure, reliable partner. So they need America to still be in the tent, at least for the short to medium term. But I'll tell you one thing, watching it did make me think that it is reflective of the fact, and it builds on what you were just saying, Emily, watching fellow leaders treat America in that way now, like a kind of, in that kind of like courtier kind of fashion as a supplicant, is reflective of the fact that under Trump, America has become something different. It's just become like another great power that just uses its hard power and its leverage rather than its moral and political leadership. You know, in the past, American political leaders would want respect, and they would want fidelity. And what Trump wants is tribute, and he wants fealty. He wants blind loyalty.
Yeah, I wonder whether what we're reaching for is that they're treating it slightly more like they're dealing with an autocracy.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Quite frankly.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, you know, not that they would kowtow to every autocracy, but that they don't see America as one of them anymore. They have to use a different language, a different way of communicating, a different way of... I mean, it is basically, it's like when you go to China and you have to sit through 10 courses of a banquet, because to do anything other would be ridiculously impolite and undiplomatic and would, you know, not give the Chinese face. It's like the whole thing is geared around trying to give Trump face, which is kind of what you do to autocrats.
Well, it's sort of, it's more like the school bully rather than the head prefect.
Yeah.
You know, it's like someone speaking constantly out of power and strength rather than out of legitimacy and authority. And that's the transition that America has undergone.
But what we should talk about in the middle of all this is the leaked intelligence report that came out of the US last night, which was another reason for fearing that Trump would be in an extremely bad mood when he landed. And the intelligence report was slightly mixed. It was talking about the damage that had been done to Iran's nuclear facilities by those US bombs on Saturday. And it suggested that although evidence was inconclusive, it hadn't been quite as final or as devastating, or in Trump's words, as obliterating as the president had suggested. Trump was furious, and he started by calling the report fake news. He started by accusing the media of disseminating the wrong kind of information. And what you noticed was that nobody around him dared to comment on this until they landed. And once they did land here, I think the language softened a bit. And Trump sitting next to Russia again was saying, well, he actually said, I don't want to use an example of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but it was essentially the same thing. In other words, he is comparing those strikes to the atomic strike on Japan at the end of the Second World War that took Japan out of the war. I think that is a bit of an extreme example, and he's kind of dropping it, as he often does. He drops the names in and then rows back from it. But what he's trying to say is he thinks it was completely game-changing. And I think the truth is we don't yet know. Marco Rubio gave an interview where he says he thinks it has set Iran back. And you can listen to what he says here.
Basically, you drilled a hole into the ground with 12 incredible bombs and then went 300 feet into a mountain. So I don't think we're going to be sending anyone down the hole anytime soon into those mountains. So suffice it to say that we are very confident. And by the way, it's not just me saying this. The director of the IAEA This is the line he used the other day. He said, the Iran nuclear program that was before the attack and after the attack, and they're dramatically different things. That's his line, and he's an expert at this. The most important thing here at the end of the day is they have less capacity today than they did just a week ago to rapidly produce a nuclear weapon behind the world's back and threaten the world. And the president deserves a tremendous amount of credit for taking this bold stand. And these pilots did something extraordinary. They flew halfway across the world and dropped 12 munition bombs perfectly and did the world a great favor. These pilots did an incredible job. I mean, I'm blown away by it. Science fiction stuff. I mean, you don't believe it's possible, but what they did.
But essentially, we are left with a sense that, yes, maybe Trump has shown that he's prepared to go in to strike Iran, but maybe what was done over the weekend has done nothing more than delay uranium enrichment there for a few months.
Yeah, indeed, and do the thing that those who cautioned against strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities always warned might happen, which is it simply cements Iranian ambition to obtain a nuclear weapon. I mean, I note today, for example, that the Iranian parliament has voted, which is a rubber stamping organisation, but nonetheless, has voted to ban IAEA inspections from the country, to withdraw cooperation. So whatever, and it was an imperfect arrangement because they were hiding things from the IAEA, but we did get some information from them. They were subject to some checks. If that ends, arguably we're in an even worse position than we were before. And we won't really know, like you said, Emily, we can't know for sure. And the Americans, under the Trump administration, certainly aren't going to be straightforward and honest with us about it. We can't know for sure exactly what will have happened, by how much the Iranian capabilities have truly been degraded.
We wanted to get a sense of what the leaders themselves think has happened here at this summit over the last 2 days. Estonia, one of the Baltic countries that is right on Russia's border, has been at the forefront of trying to get NATO members to pay up, to really recognise the threat that is living next door to them. And we're going to speak now to Hanno Pekka. He's the Estonian Defence Secretary, about what he thinks has happened here this week. Minister, I think there was a lot of uncertainty ahead of President Trump's arrival here, what kind of mood he'd be in, what kind of commitments he would be making to NATO. Do you feel reassured by what you've heard so far?
Well, I believe that, one thing we all as Europeans committed is that we will do more. And, Estonia will do 5.4 only on hard defense. When we add on top of that also this 1.5, I would say that we will go to 7% with the defense spendings. So, but nevertheless, I believe that the U.S. delegation, it's not only President Trump, also Secretary Rubio and Secretary Hexet. So they got this confirmation from the Europeans that we will do more, we will step up, we will do more also on the industry level. And this was something they came for coming to Europe. And I believe that that this shakiness between the Europe and US is now gone. Of course, there is a lot to do, and we need to deliver also. But at least, when we take also the Germany's contribution, Sweden announcement just a few days ago, many good news. So I believe that, this 5% is now confirmed, and then we can clearly say that.
So you've got Spain to come to the table on 5%. You've got Slovakia to come to the table on 5%.
Everyone is behind that commitment. Of course, we have to understand, that some of the countries will do it quicker. So some of the countries will front load.
You're already ahead of that.
We have that already today. So we have 5% even today, when I just count what we have today as defense spendings and what we are doing additionally to that. So this is, of course, depending on the country's domestic politics, many ways. But anyway, so all the countries are behind that commitment, what the declaration says.
So you've given your commitment. Did you have enough of a commitment from the US, from President Trump? Do you feel that he truly recognises what Article 5 involves, which is coming to the rescue if Europe is invaded?
Well, when you take the declaration, of course, it will be published very soon. So when you take the declaration, then there is no doubt about it. So Article 5, one for all for one principle, attack on one is attack on all. This is there. The second thing, that when I heard also what President Trump said, he was very clear that US is committed to its allies, and the allies can be sure of the US commitment.
So it's in writing, in your heart. Do you feel confident?
Well, when the President of the United States says something that during the summit to all of the allies, how we cannot be sure? I'm a true believer of NATO, and we are not defending only our people, only our countries. We are defending the values, and I truly believe that the United States, as a watchdog of democracy, will stand for these values, what we are defending and protecting.
You think that President Trump is a watchdog of democracy? I mean, that's something that a lot of his former allies don't necessarily believe anymore.
Well, the reality is, that in last two conflicts, Pakistan, India, Iran, Israel, he has played a big role to achieve very quick ceasefire. So, still I believe that, the American values are for democracy, not for the dictatorship. So this is why I truly believe, that the core principle of American identity is democracy. And that means, as I said also yesterday, during our dinner, that when we have the choice between the freedom and the peace, we always choose freedom. So, and this is why, we have to stand for these values very hard.
Let me just ask you something. There is a slightly odd mood here, which I think was exemplified by the letter that Mark Rutte wrote privately to the president, which was then leaked on social media, which suggested an aura of fear and flattery amongst many of the leaders here, that they are treating Trump like a child, like a toddler almost, having to keep him happy in case he suddenly leaves or quits as he did the G7, keep things tight, keep things friendly, flatter him. I mean, do you sometimes feel that NATO is playing a kind of ridiculous game with this man, that he's being treated as a baby and as a world king at the same time?
Well, I really do not see that. US is not only President Trump. Of course, President Trump is playing a big role as a president, but the United States as a country is much more. And these values, as I said, about the democracy, freedom, rule of law, freedom of speech, all this, what is the core value of democracy. So this is still there, and this has always been there and will stay there. And that, of course, these are the same values we are fighting for here in Europe.
I understand the values. I guess I'm asking about the language. Is the language of flattery the only one that works here now?
Well, I believe that what works is also the work of diplomats, the work of all these people behind that who put together this declaration, who worked days and nights to get this deal done. And we have the 5% deal now, and it has not been easy. It has not been easy for Estonia, even though we have that already, decided many months back. It has become with the hard work of raising the taxes, of cutting the spendings anywhere else. So it has not been, easy walk in the park. It has been a difficult job for us, as it is in the coming years for many countries in Europe. So it's a hard work what we have to do, and also, to be honest, a year ago in Washington, nobody believed that we will sit here today in The Hague and confirming 5% on defense so quickly. And this is a big achievement.
Minister, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Joining us now is Peter Frankopan, author of Silk Roads, about that nexus between China and Iran and the Middle East, written astonishingly some 10 years ago. And he's here at the NATO summit as a keynote speaker, trying to put some of what is happening this week into a more historical context. And Peter, if we just ask you to give us a sense of the mood here, in comparison to NATO summits that you've attended before, what is the shift that you're feeling?
Well, first, the declaration gets issued in the first place. There's been lots of toing and froing about the language on Russia, partly to do with how the US, what it's willing to say and get NATO to sign up to. Much, much softer, possibly even aggressively keen to keep the heat away from Russia, which is problematic for a lot of NATO member states. But there will be a declaration, and so that's something. I think what's interesting is we've been talking 2 weeks ago, before Israel's bombing of Iran, the mood would have been very different. It would have all been about Ukraine, Russia, and the eastern frontiers. Now, because we're a few days after the US getting involved in Iran too, there's a sense, elation maybe is too strong a word, but there's a sense of dynamism, of optimism. People are going to spend 5%, the Germans are going to borrow money, people are going to stuff cash into defence. And that all feels like it's slightly unreal, the kind of idea that all the problems have been solved and gone away. So there's always a bit of shifting sands, but I think that because so much has been going on in the last couple of weeks in lots of different parts of the world, it's quite hard to keep on top of it all. So there's a lot of kind of froth, I think. I mean, we've forgotten literally a month ago, India and Pakistan nearly, when they came to blows, and we were on the point of nuclear confrontation between two nuclear states, and that's forgotten.
Yeah.
It's gone. So I think there's hope, but there's probably a little bit more optimism here than I think is probably warranted.
Right, so more optimism than is warranted because they're talking about figures of 5%, and you think everyone's sort of assuming that the job is now done. Is that right? Or
yeah, I mean, I think Europe, or NATO, I should say, feels like it's putting its house in order. All the members have been rounded up and told they've got to pay their subscriptions. There's a little bit of foot dragging by Pedro Sanchez, who is obviously told whatever he does, Spain's Prime Minister, to not catch Trump's eye. Ideally, don't talk to him. And if Trump says you've got to pay up, please don't make a scene. We saw.
But he is doing now. I mean, Spain's committed.
I think what one learns about these kinds of things is there are different ways of being creative with your accounting, and what your commitment is, how you spend it. Do traffic police count as part of your domestic security? There are lots of ways of rolling things up to make the number sound bigger than it is. I mean, one of the big problems we have in Europe is massive duplication. So there are 15 different battle tanks produced here. The United States has one. There are 28 different frigates and destroyers produced by European states and only 4 by the US. So lots of different businesses are doing exactly the same job, and that's a very inefficient way of doing things unless they're innovating or making things better. So some of the story about Europe putting its house in order is probably right, but there are a lot of big questions that I think aren't being asked.
You talked about Iran. It has been quite an intense 24 hours or so. Trump definitely wasn't happy as he left the White House yesterday and had a very clear message to Israel and to Iran to give him a ceasefire that he wanted before touching down here. And overnight we had that report from US intelligence services that suggested that the damage that US bombs had done to Iran's nuclear facilities wasn't actually as intense as Trump had been telling us. Do you have any sense of the level of damage that has actually been done there?
I'd probably need to have a slightly higher skill set to the one I have. I think what's revealing is the thinness of the skin that Trump and Pete Hegseth have had when being asked about it. So Trump today here in The Hague has called journalists scum for daring to challenge or to question what the damage levels were. And I think that reaction is revealing in itself. I mean, for what it's worth, I think that Iran had expected there would be big bombing raids on the 3 major facilities. From what we can tell in advance, tunnels have been backfilled and all the enriched uranium, 400 kilos or so, had been moved. Quite where, we don't know. I think in a way it doesn't matter.
So in other words, nothing has been hurt in that attack?
Yeah, no, I'm not quite sure that's right. I think what's important is that the US has shown that it is willing to use force and capable of doing it. Iran basically has been wiped clean of all of its air cover and defense systems. So there's free running for Israel or for the United States or maybe for anybody else to take shots at whatever they like. So what Trump did, I think, it's more important that he showed that if there's a stepping out of the red lines, and above all, what his main reaction actually was that Iran had not replied to him in time. He'd set deadlines, and Iran were, perhaps not surprisingly, the comms are going to be difficult in knowing what happened with pages with Hezbollah, knowing what's happened with Israeli intelligence, who's obviously penetrated the entirety of Iranian politics and the military, that the communications are poor. But I think Trump went for the run in because he was trying to focus minds. So he'll go again. So I think it sets it back. So Trump has been saying set it back years. It's an academic discussion at the moment, I think, about how much that really matters, whether it's weeks, months or years.
I mean, the language that he used when he was sitting next to Mark Rutte was, I don't want to use an example of Hiroshima. I don't want to use an example of Nagasaki. But it was essentially the same thing. He's comparing what happened on Saturday night with the the atomic bombing of Japan?
Look, I think if Trump were to do a history exam, I'm not sure how well he would do on giving the right answers, but that doesn't mean he's necessarily wrong. I think what Trump understands instinctively is that Iran is in a critically weak position, and that gives an opportunity to force them to the negotiating table. I think the really interesting and tricky question now is what kind of settlement can be agreed by Tehran and by Washington, and of course by Netanyahu in Israel. And you can push too far. It's very delicate, I think, to get the frames right, because presumably what happens is there's going to be high levels of repression in Iran when things settle down. The reason why Iran has downed tools and agreed a ceasefire is that it's more or less defenseless. So what comes next? It's important that we don't have a Versailles moment where Iran is punitively taken on by the US and by Israel and pushed into a place where it has to respond in a generation to come. But that I think is
that was the William Hague argument, wasn't it? That actually what has happened to Iran now will give future leaders the sense that they do actually need to build nuclear weapons.
Well, I think we're in an age where we should get used, I'm afraid to say it, but of state-on-state violence. We've seen that with Russia and Ukraine, Israel across the Middle East, in Gaza, and now in Iran. India and Pakistan with the major problem over Kashmir, but also other issues too. India and China have come to blows with their soldiers in the last 5 years in the Doklam Plateau. And I think there are lots of push points where states will be looking about how they use their military and strategic advantage to reshape the world in their own image. So, in fact, a couple of days ago, we've heard Erdogan in Turkey say that Turkey will not stand by and allow the Middle East to undergo a new Sykes-Picot agreement, which is the famous carving up of the Middle East by Britain and France in the First World War. And those ideas of being able to claim that a preemptive strike is an act of self-defense it's a dangerous world that we're living in.
Yeah, when you kind of enumerate all the different conflicts, it's hard not to kind of imagine future students saying, well, all the signs were there that this was going to lead to something that felt like a global war. I'm sure people were sitting there in, 1912, 1913, looking at all the disparate sort of antagonies in the world and not realising how close they were to a global conflict that was World War One.
Yeah, I think that in these moments where you see these big, giant interlocking plates, it's the disruptor event that suddenly fractures everything. So, no one had Sarajevo in 1914 and the assassination of an Austrian archduke on their bingo card for what would be the spark that would ignite the First World War and reshape empires, reshape the whole world. Likewise, no one would have thought that in 1939 there would be an agreement between Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union, and yet a sort of a deal plucked out of the blue carved up the whole of Poland, whole of Eastern Europe, led to the invasion and the occupation of the Baltic states, and created some of the issues we look at in Ukraine today. And that was a sort of out of the blue moment. So I think that's what at events like this, it's can you remind people that those sudden disruptor points, the calculations when you suddenly have something unexpected can be catastrophic. Yeah. And I think here the conviction that everything's going to be okay as long as we pump enough money and weapons into Ukraine, there's a chance of holding the Russians. That's probably true, but I don't think we're thinking beyond those kind of horizons of a few weeks and months, rather than what does NATO, what does Europe need to be functional, the UK need to be functional in the 10, 20, 30 years ahead.
Before we end, let's just talk about language. There was the text, the private text that Mark Rutte sent to Trump that was leaked by the president himself to his Truth Social account 1 minute later. Mark Rutte talking about big spending and putting it all in bloc capitals. Today, Rutte, I think, used the word daddy.
I saw that.
It's kind of a bit vom, isn't it?
So daddy sometimes needs to use strong language to deal with the kids.
Yeah.
Israel and Iran, we don't even need to, say any more than that. I guess there are two ways of looking at it. One is that it sows supplication and it shows that the way in which you have to engage with Trump is to flatter his ego, to go for his narcissism, to talk like him, and Rutte probably joins other leading global figures like J.D. Vance, for example, who talks as remodeled his language to sound like Trump. The whole MAGA movement sounds like Trump, and in fact even look like Trump. There's a kind of MAGA look now to I think everyone's being more generous. It's that, the reality is that Trump is the most powerful man on the planet. Like it or not, he has a very specific view of what he thinks the world can and should be like. I probably, over time, I wouldn't say I'm benign, but I think Trump has been more shaped by the Cold War than I think I'd realised. And his anxieties about nuclear weapons, about proliferation, I think is something that has a long, much deeper roots than I thought. So to some extent...
Why is he being so gracious and forgiving of Putin then?
Because his calculation is that Russia's got enough nuclear warheads to make life difficult for the United States and to start a potential global nuclear war that leads to mass destruction where Iran doesn't. So you've got to deal with what you've got in front of you. I think often diplomatic language is about how do you say the right thing to the right person. I mean, there are loads of examples of how people address the Mongol Khans, and you've got to speak the language in the way that they want you to. In some cases, some countries, you have to touch your forehead to the ground when you're in the presence of the Byzantine emperor or in the presence of the Chinese emperor. And if you don't want it, if you don't like it, then find other friends. I think if you want to play ball and you want Trump on side, it's probably worth swallowing your pride, putting stuff in capital letters, and getting on with it. Because the risks we have in Europe, which earlier in the year when Trump became president, there was talk that this summit would be the moment where Trump announced he was pulling out of NATO. So if a little bit of self-flagellation, humiliation, and remodeling of your caps lock, probably we should be a bit forgiving. But seeing two statesmen talk like that about that kids being disciplined and therefore it's okay to swear, it's a little bit surreal. But I can promise you things could be a lot worse if the events of the last couple of weeks had turned out differently.
Peter Frankopan, thank you so much. Thanks.
Right, that is it from us at the NATO summit in The Hague. We've been sat at the world's busiest spot. We've managed to just find a moment where the Deputy Prime Minister of Luxembourg isn't kissing people to say goodbye to you. It has been an extraordinary couple of days. I think easily the most remarkable summit in this organisation's 76-year history. But where are we? Are we any further forward? While Donald Trump is committed to Article 5 for now, perhaps European states can sleep a little bit easier than they might have done 24 hours ago. But as we know, with Donald Trump, there are never, ever full stops. There are only commas and ellipses. Who knows? In a few weeks' time, a few days' time, a few months' time, NATO will be scratching its head trying to think about how to keep Trump inside the tent all over again. Because if the last week has taught us anything, if there is a special relationship anywhere with the United States and another country, an absolute certainty of another country they will defend come what may, it would be Israel, not Europe or any of the states they're in. We'll be back tomorrow. See you then. Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.